The thermometer outside Angus MacLeod's corrugated metal shelter read 58 degrees below zero, yet inside he sat in his shirt sleeves feeding small pieces of coal to a modest stove. 200 yards up the mountain, Fergus Drummond was burning his furniture to stay alive in a cabin that had taken 6 weeks to build. Before we continue, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier ingenuity interest you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable. The miners gathered outside Callahan's supply tent on a gray October afternoon in 1897, watching Angus MacLeod haul another sheet of corrugated metal up the mountain trail. It was his 8th trip that week, and the laughter had become a daily ritual. Fergus Drummond stood with his arms crossed, shaking his head, as Angus disappeared around the bend toward his claim. "He's building a root cellar," someone suggested. "A roof with no walls," another corrected. "A coffin," Fergus said flatly. "That's what he's building, a metal coffin he'll freeze to death in come January." The Bitterroot mining district had seen its share of eccentric men, but Angus MacLeod's project defied explanation. While every other prospector had spent late summer and early fall cutting logs and constructing proper cabins, Angus had made repeated trips down to the abandoned Copperhead mine, returning each time with salvaged corrugated metal sheets strapped to his pack mule. The sheets were weathered, some rusted, others still showing traces of galvanized coating. They looked like refuse, and the other miners treated them as such. Angus's claim sat on the eastern slope of the ridge, a moderately promising gold placer that he and his partner Donald Rafferty had staked in May. Donald had built himself a respectable cabin by August, a solid 12 by 16 structure with proper corner notching and a stone fireplace. It stood proudly near the creek, smoke rising from its chimney on cool evenings. Donald had urged Angus to build something similar, but Angus had refused, speaking in vague terms about a better method. By September, when the first frost touched the high country, Angus still had no visible dwelling. He had dug a trench, which made no sense to anyone. The trench was roughly 20 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 3 feet deep. He'd spent 2 weeks excavating it, piling the dirt nearby in careful mounds. Then he'd begun positioning the corrugated metal sheets, bending them over what appeared to be a wooden frame, creating a curved structure that resembled a barrel laid on its side. The other miners had stopped by to offer advice, which Angus politely ignored. They explained that metal would conduct cold, that he needed solid log walls, that he was wasting time on foolishness. Fergus had been particularly vocal, having taken a protective interest in the younger man since they'd met on the trail north. He considered Angus a friend, which made watching this disaster more frustrating. "You'll be begging for space in my cabin come December," Fergus had told him just last week. Angus had simply smiled, continuing to pack dirt against the lower half of his metal structure, creating what looked like an oversized mound with a metal cap. Now, in mid-October, the structure was nearly complete. It looked utterly foreign among the log cabins scattered across the district, a strange half-buried metal tunnel that seemed more mining equipment than dwelling. No one believed it would work. Most thought Angus wouldn't survive his first real winter. Some had already wagered on how soon he'd abandon the claim. Spring 1897 had brought Angus MacLeod and Donald Rafferty into the Bitterroot district with cautious optimism. They'd met in Butte, both Scotsmen working different mines, both restless for independence. When rumors of new placer deposits reached them, they'd pooled resources and headed into the mountains together. The partnership was practical rather than deep friendship, but it worked well enough. They'd staked adjacent claims along a promising creek drainage, spending May and June building sluice boxes and testing the gravel. The gold was there, fine flour gold, mixed with occasional small nuggets, enough to justify staying through winter. By July, they'd established a rhythm, working their claims during daylight hours, sharing meals and conversation in the evenings. That's when Angus first mentioned his concerns about winter shelter. They'd encountered an old trapper named Micah Thorne who'd spent 15 winters in the mountains. Micah had shown them his cabin, a well-built structure that had nonetheless nearly killed him the previous January. The gaps between logs had frozen solid, despite careful chinking. Ice had formed on the interior walls. He'd burned through 4 cords of wood in 3 weeks and still couldn't keep the space above freezing at night. "The cold finds every weakness," Micah had told them. "Corners, especially. The wind gets in where logs meet, no matter how careful you are, and heat rises, so you're burning fuel to warm the roof while your feet freeze." Donal had dismissed this as poor construction. He'd helped build cabins in the Highlands, knew proper technique, believed he could do better. But Angus had listened differently, hearing not criticism of technique, but identification of fundamental design problems. Traditional cabins fought against winter rather than working with natural principles. Angus had mentioned earth-sheltered construction, something he'd read about in a mining journal years earlier. Underground chambers maintained stable temperatures. The earth itself provided insulation. Donal had laughed at the suggestion of living underground like a badger. They were civilized men, not animals. A proper cabin showed self-respect and competence. They'd agreed to disagree, each building according to his own judgment. Donal began cutting logs. In August, selecting straight pines and felling them with practiced efficiency. He'd built his cabin in 3 weeks, a structure that looked solid and traditional, the kind of dwelling that proclaimed a man knew his business. He'd been proud of it, and rightly so, by conventional standards. Angus had started differently. He'd taken his mule down to the abandoned Copperhead mine, exploring the old operations. The mine had closed 2 years earlier after a cave-in killed 3 men. Equipment lay scattered and rusting. Among the debris, Angus found corrugated metal sheets that had formed part of a processing building. The metal was weathered, but structurally sound. More importantly, it was available, and it could be shaped. He'd begun hauling sheets up to his claim in late August, already planning the curved structure that would become his shelter. Donal had watched these efforts with increasing bewilderment, finally asking what possible use bent metal could serve. Angus had tried explaining thermal mass, earth insulation, and curved structural principles, but Donal heard only strange theories that contradicted generations of proven building methods. October brought the first serious cold to the high country. Temperatures dropped to 15 degrees below zero on the night of October 23rd, an unusually early and severe freeze that caught several miners unprepared. Donal Rafferty's cabin, though well built by traditional standards, revealed its weaknesses immediately. He woke that morning to find ice coating the interior walls near the corners. His water bucket had frozen solid, despite sitting only 6 feet from the fireplace. The gaps between logs had contracted in the cold, opening hairline cracks that whistled with incoming air. Donal spent that day re-chinking every visible gap, mixing clay and moss and forcing it into the spaces between logs. He burned through his wood supply faster than anticipated, feeding the fire constantly to maintain barely tolerable interior temperatures. By evening, the cold had intensified further, 22 below zero. Donal wore every piece of clothing he owned, huddled close to the fire, and still shivered. Angus's structure, still incomplete, nonetheless kept him comfortable that night. The partial earth banking and curved metal shell held heat from his small coal stove with remarkable efficiency. He'd positioned the stove carefully, allowing the curved interior to reflect warmth throughout the compact space. He slept in moderate comfort, waking only twice to add coal. The extreme cold lasted 3 days. On the second day, Donal made a critical mistake born of desperation. His firewood was running low, so he decided to venture out to retrieve logs he'd cut but not yet hauled to his cabin. They were stacked a quarter-mile away, near where he'd been felling trees. He bundled himself heavily and set out in mid-afternoon when temperatures had supposedly moderated to 10 below. He'd miscalculated both the distance and his endurance in extreme cold. The exertion of dragging logs through deep snow caused him to sweat beneath his layers. When he stopped to rest, that moisture began freezing against his skin. His feet, already cold, became dangerously numb. He recognized the danger too late. By the time he reached his cabin, frostbite had set in. Angus found him the next morning. Donal had managed to get his boots off and seen the damage. 3 toes on his left foot were black, the tissue already dying. Angus helped him down to the supply camp, where a doctor with mining company experience examined the injury. The toes would have to come off to prevent gangrene from spreading. The operation happened that afternoon on Callahan's supply table, Donal biting leather while the doctor worked. Donal left the mountains a week later, riding out on a wagon headed for Butte. The partnership was dissolved without formal discussion. Donal's cabin stood empty, his claim abandoned. He'd said little to Angus before departing, but his eyes had held accusation, as if Angus's unconventional choices had somehow caused this disaster. Angus understood. Men needed someone to blame when their certainties proved inadequate. Donal's departure left Angus alone on the mountain, with winter approaching and a half-finished shelter that everyone considered madness. The injury haunted him, not from guilt, but from recognition. Donal had survived 7 winters in Highland Scotland, knew cold weather, understood cabin construction, and had built according to proven methods. Yet he'd nearly died and lost part of his body to frost. The traditional approach, executed competently, had failed. Angus spent the evenings after Donal's departure examining the fundamental problems. Traditional log cabins presented enormous surface area to the cold. A 12 by 16 cabin with 8-foot walls had roughly 640 square feet of exterior surface through which heat could escape. Every log junction, every corner, every chinking gap represented a potential thermal breach. The rectangular design created corners where cold air pooled and structural stress concentrated. The peaked roof, necessary for shedding snow, created a large volume that required heating despite being useless space. More critically, traditional cabins fought against their environment. They sat above ground, fully exposed to wind and temperature extremes. They relied entirely on continuous fuel consumption to maintain livable conditions. When fuel ran low or temperatures dropped beyond certain thresholds, the structure became a liability rather than protection. Donal's experience proved this conclusively. Angus's mind kept returning to a principle he'd observed in mining operations. Underground chambers maintained relatively stable temperatures year-round. 50 feet below the surface, temperatures held steady around 45 to 50 degrees regardless of surface conditions. The Earth itself acted as a massive thermal battery, its temperature determined by depth rather than season. This wasn't theory, it was observed fact that every hard rock miner knew. The question was how to apply this principle to habitable shelter without actually living in a mine shaft. Complete underground construction was impractical for a single man with limited time and tools. But partial earth sheltering might capture the benefits while remaining buildable. If the lower portion of a structure was surrounded by earth, that earth would moderate temperature swings. The ground wouldn't freeze beyond a certain depth, meaning the earth-contacted portions of the dwelling would never experience true extreme cold. The second principle involved geometry. Rectangular structures had corners, and corners created problems. They concentrated structural stress, created air circulation dead zones, and provided leverage points for failure. Curved structures distributed stress evenly across their entire surface. An arch was inherently stronger than a flat span of the same material. A dome or barrel vault could support loads that would crush a rectangular structure of equivalent wall thickness. Angus had seen this principle in mine tunnel construction. Arched tunnels remained stable under enormous overhead pressure. Rectangular tunnels required heavy timber shoring to prevent collapse. The arch shape converted vertical load into horizontal compression, which materials like stone, brick, or metal could resist almost indefinitely. Applied to a dwelling, a curved roof would shed snow naturally, distribute wind loads evenly, and create an interior with no cold pooling corners. The third principle was thermal mass and insulation working together. A thin metal shell alone would conduct cold readily. But metal surrounded by earth became something different. Angus returned to the abandoned Copperhead mine with renewed purpose the day after Donal left. The October cold had broken temporarily, giving him a narrow window to complete his hauling before winter locked in permanently. The mine sat 3 miles down the valley, a journey that took 2 hours each way with his pack mule loaded. He would need to make at least 10 more trips to gather sufficient metal. The Copperhead had closed in 1895 after a tunnel collapse killed 3 miners and destroyed investor confidence. The owners had abandoned everything too heavy or worthless to transport back to Butte. Corrugated metal sheeting that had formed walls and roofing for surface buildings lay scattered across the site, slowly rusting. Most sheets were 8 feet long and 3 feet wide, weighing roughly 40 pounds each. Angus could load 4 sheets per trip without overloading his mule. Other miners watched his efforts with open amusement. Fergus Drummond stopped him on the trail during his 3rd trip, genuinely concerned. "That metal will turn your shelter into an icebox," Fergus said. "Metal conducts cold faster than anything. You'd be better off with canvas walls." Angus had tried explaining that the metal wouldn't be exposed to air on both sides, that earth banking would change its thermal properties entirely, but Fergus had simply shaken his head. The older man saw salvaged rust and drew obvious conclusions. Angus thanked him for his concern and continued up the trail. The mockery intensified with each trip. Miners gathered at Callahan's tent in the evenings, speculating about what Angus was building. A livestock shelter, some suggested, a storage shed for equipment, a smelting operation, though that made no sense at this elevation. No one seriously believed he intended to winter in whatever he was constructing. "He'll last until Christmas," one miner wagered. "Then he'll either move into town or beg space in someone's proper cabin." "November," another countered. "First real snow, he'll see sense." Angus heard these conversations when he came down for supplies. He didn't argue or defend his plans. Explanations required understanding principles. These men had no framework to accept. Their certainty came from tradition and collective agreement. They'd all built log cabins. Their fathers had built log cabins. Therefore log cabins were correct, and alternatives were foolishness. By early November, Angus had transported 32 corrugated sheets to his claim. Some were galvanized steel, still silvery despite weathering. Others were plain iron, showing rust but structurally sound. He'd also salvaged tar paper, oakum from old pipe fittings, and several buckets of tar that had solidified but could be reheated. These materials would seal the joints between metal sheets, creating a continuous weatherproof skin. The final trip brought wooden beams he'd found at the mine site, former roof supports from the processing building. These would form the internal frame that gave his barrel vault its shape and supported the corrugated sheets during construction. With these pieces assembled, Angus had everything needed to complete his shelter. Winter was perhaps 3 weeks away. The other miners had stopped joking and started taking bets on his survival. Angus ignored them all and began the critical phase of construction. The foundation trench Angus had dug in September now proved its purpose. 3 feet deep and extending below the frost line, the trench created a stable base that would never heave or shift with freeze-thaw cycles. He'd lined the bottom with flat stones gathered from the creek, creating drainage and a level surface. This preparation, which had seemed pointless to observers, was actually essential to everything that followed. Angus began by installing the wooden frame. He'd cut the beams into curved ribs, steaming them over his fire until the wood became pliable, then bending them into arcs and securing the shape with temporary bracing. Each rib was identical, creating a consistent barrel vault profile. He positioned 7 ribs along the 20-foot length of his structure, spacing them roughly 3 feet apart. The ribs sat in the foundation trench with their tops forming a smooth, curved line approximately 8 feet above the interior floor level. The geometry was deliberate. An 8-foot radius created an interior tall enough to stand in at the center while keeping the total volume small enough to heat efficiently. The curve began at ground level on each side, meaning there were no vertical walls. Everything was arc. This eliminated corners entirely and created the strongest possible shape for the materials he was using. Once the ribs were positioned and braced, Angus began attaching the corrugated metal sheets. He started at the bottom on one side, positioning the first sheet so it extended into the foundation trench. The corrugations ran perpendicular to the length of the structure, allowing the metal to bend more easily over the curved frame. He secured each sheet to the wooden ribs using salvaged nails, positioning them in the valleys between corrugations where they would be least visible and most protected from weather. The second sheet overlapped the first by 6 inches, creating a shingled effect that would shed water downward. Angus sealed the overlap with heated tar, painting it carefully along the joint. The tar cooled and hardened, creating a waterproof seal. He worked methodically, adding sheets one at a time, moving up the curve toward the peak. Each sheet had to be positioned precisely to maintain the smooth arc and ensure proper overlap. The peak presented a special challenge. The final sheets from each side met at the top, creating a ridge joint that needed careful sealing. Angus created a cap from a flat piece of salvaged metal, bending it lengthwise to cover the ridge. He tarred this heavily, then secured it with closely spaced nails. The result was weatherproof and structurally continuous. The entire exterior skin took 5 days to install. When finished, the structure looked strange but coherent. A smooth metal barrel emerging from the ground, its surface a patchwork of silver galvanized sections and rust-brown iron panels. The corrugations caught light differently depending on angle, creating a rippled appearance. It looked nothing like a dwelling, which was exactly why the other miners dismissed it. But Angus saw what they couldn't. He saw a continuous shell with no gaps, no corners, no joints where cold could penetrate. He saw a shape that would distribute snow load evenly and shed accumulation naturally. He saw the beginning of something that would prove functional in ways traditional construction couldn't match. The exterior metal shell was complete, but the critical innovation lay in what came next. Angus spent the following week moving earth, a task that looked like manual labor but was actually precision engineering. He began by backfilling the foundation trench on both sides, packing soil firmly against the lower portion of the metal shell. The earth came up to roughly 3 feet above the original ground level, covering the bottom third of the curved structure. This wasn't random banking. Angus shaped the earth carefully, creating a gradual slope away from the structure for drainage while ensuring continuous contact between soil and metal. He tamped the earth in layers, preventing air pockets that would reduce thermal transfer. Where others saw him burying his shelter, he was actually creating a thermal battery that would moderate interior temperatures regardless of surface conditions. The principle was simple but revolutionary for this application. Earth 3 feet below the surface maintained a relatively constant temperature year-round, approximately 45 to 50 degrees in this climate. By surrounding the lower portion of his structure with earth, Angus created a zone where the interior would never drop below that temperature, even if surface air reached 60 below zero. The earth acted as insulation against temperature extremes while providing thermal mass that absorbed and released heat slowly. Traditional cabins sat entirely above ground, their floors and lower walls fully exposed to whatever temperature the air reached. Heat escaped through the floor as readily as through walls and roof. Angus's design eliminated this massive source of heat loss. His floor sat against earth that would never freeze, creating a stable, thermal foundation that required no heating. He'd calculated the volumes carefully. The earth-banked portion represented roughly 40% of his total exterior surface area. That 40% would maintain stable temperature passively, requiring no fuel. Only the upper 60%, exposed to air, would experience true temperature swings. Even that portion benefited from the curved shape, which minimized surface area relative to interior volume. Angus moved 27 cubic yards of earth during this phase, working alone with a shovel and wheelbarrow he'd built from salvaged lumber. His neighbors watched occasionally, shaking their heads at the effort. Fergus Drummond stopped by on the fourth day, trying once more to talk sense into the younger man. "You're burying yourself alive," Fergus said. "That earth will draw moisture. The metal will rust through in 2 seasons. And you still haven't solved the cold problem. Metal conducts heat away faster than logs ever would." Angus paused his work, leaning on his shovel. "The metal only conducts heat when there's a temperature difference between inside and outside," he explained. "The earth-contacted portion has no temperature difference. The ground stays warm. The metal equalizes to ground temperature. No conduction, no heat loss." Fergus frowned, trying to follow the logic. "But the top half is exposed." "Smaller surface area than a traditional cabin," Angus replied. "And curved, so no corners were cold pools. Plus the earth banking stabilizes the whole structure. The warm bottom keeps the top from getting as cold as it would otherwise." Fergus remained skeptical but had no technical argument to counter. He left shaking his head, certain Angus was overlooking something obvious that would prove fatal come January. Angus returned to his earth-moving, knowing explanation was futile until demonstration proved the concept. With the earth banking complete, Angus turned his attention to sealing every potential air leak in the metal shell. Traditional log cabins had hundreds of gaps requiring chinking, and even careful work left microscopic channels where cold air infiltrated. His corrugated metal structure theoretically had no gaps, but the overlapping seams between sheets needed treatment to ensure absolute impermeability. He started by inspecting every seam, looking for areas where the tar he'd applied during installation had thinned or missed coverage. The tar had hardened in the cold, creating a brittle seal that might crack under thermal expansion and contraction. Angus needed something more flexible, something that would move with the metal while maintaining weatherproof integrity. His solution combined 3 materials. First, oakum, the tar-impregnated hemp fiber used for sealing pipe joints in mining operations. He'd salvaged roughly 20 pounds of it from the Copperhead mine, dried fibers that could be softened and worked into any gap. Second, pine resin that he collected from trees near his claim, boiling it down to concentrate its adhesive and waterproof properties. Third, additional tar that he kept liquid by heating it in a small pot over his fire. Angus mixed the pine resin with tar in a 2-to-1 ratio, creating a compound that remained pliable when cool but wouldn't run when warm. He worked this mixture into strands of oakum, saturating the fibers completely. The result was a flexible rope-like material that could be pressed into seams and would conform to any irregular surface. Working from bottom to top, Angus applied this compound to every seam where metal sheets overlapped. He pressed the oakum mixture firmly into the valleys between corrugations, ensuring complete coverage. The work was tedious and hard on his hands. The tar mixture was sticky and difficult to clean off, but each sealed seam brought him closer to a completely airtight envelope. The seams around his window and door openings required special attention. He'd cut these openings through single sheets of metal, creating holes that needed substantial frames and weatherproofing. For the window, a 10-inch by 12-inch opening positioned high on one curved wall, he'd built a wooden frame from milled lumber he'd purchased at Callahan's tent. The frame fit tightly into the opening, secured with bolts through the metal. Angus sealed the junction between wood and metal with thick applications of his oakum compound, building up layers until no light showed through. The door opening at one end of the barrel vault required similar treatment on a larger scale. He'd framed it with heavy timbers, creating a rectangular opening 4 feet wide and 6.5 feet tall. The frame was mortised into the wooden ribs of his structure and bolted through the metal skin. Every junction received careful sealing. After 8 days of detail work, Angus had created what amounted to a continuous membrane. The metal shell, sealed seams, and earth banking formed an integrated envelope that had no pathway for air infiltration. This was fundamentally different from traditional construction, where gaps were inevitable and accepted. The window presented unique challenges. Angus needed light and ventilation, but every opening compromised his structure's integrity. His solution was minimalism and careful engineering. The single window, positioned 6 feet above the interior floor on the south-facing curve, was deliberately small. Glass was expensive and fragile, so he'd purchased only what he absolutely needed, a single 12 by 10-inch pane from Callahan's limited stock. He built a wooden shutter for the interior side, thick planks reinforced with cross-bracing. The shutter hinged on leather straps and could be secured closed with a wooden bar. When closed, the shutter added insulation. When open, it allowed the glass to admit light. The glass itself sat in the wooden frame he'd built, sealed with putty he'd made from linseed oil and chalk dust. The small size meant the glass could withstand wind pressure and temperature stress that would crack larger panes. For additional protection, Angus created a secondary covering using heavy canvas. He stretched the canvas across the window opening on the exterior side, tacking it to the metal shell. Then he painted the canvas with multiple coats of linseed oil, creating a translucent but weatherproof membrane. Light could pass through diffusely, even with the wooden shutter open. The canvas protected the glass from direct impact and added another layer of insulation. The heating system was equally minimalist. Angus had purchased a small cast-iron coal stove in Butte before coming to the mountains, anticipating that coal would be more practical than wood in a compact space. The stove was designed for heating tents, only 18 inches square, but adequate for the small volume he needed to warm. His entire interior space was roughly 1,200 cubic feet, a fraction of what a traditional cabin contained. He positioned the stove carefully, slightly off-center toward the door end of the structure. The curved interior walls would reflect radiant heat throughout the space. He'd calculated that the metal itself, once warm, would radiate heat evenly rather than allowing it to rise uselessly toward the ceiling, as happened in tall rectangular cabins. The chimney pipe extended vertically from the stove, passing through the metal roof near the peak. Angus created a careful seal where the pipe penetrated the shell, using a metal collar that fit around the pipe and bolted to the corrugated roofing. He sealed this with his oakum compound and added a rain cap to prevent moisture entry. The stove's small firebox was actually an advantage. Coal burned hotter and longer than wood, producing steady heat with minimal tending. Angus calculated he could maintain comfortable interior temperature using perhaps 20 pounds of coal per day, even in extreme cold. He'd stockpiled half a ton of coal, purchased cheaply in Butte, where it arrived by rail. That quantity would last the entire winter with reserves. Interior arrangements were sparse but functional. Angus built a sleeping platform along one curved wall, raising it 2 feet off the floor for storage beneath and warmer sleeping above. He constructed simple shelves for supplies, mounted securely to the wooden ribs. The first significant test came on November 9th, when overnight temperatures dropped to 23 degrees below zero. Angus had moved into his completed shelter 4 days earlier, still arranging supplies and adjusting to the space. He'd burned coal conservatively, testing how little fuel would maintain comfort. That morning he discovered something remarkable. He woke at dawn to find the interior temperature holding at 58 degrees. The small coal stove had burned down to embers overnight. Outside, the thermometer he'd mounted near the entrance read 23 below. An 81-degree difference separated interior from exterior, maintained with minimal active heating. Angus added coal to the stove and watched the interior temperature climb to 65 within an hour, using perhaps 3 pounds of fuel. 200 yards up the slope, Fergus Drummond had spent a miserable night feeding his fireplace constantly. He'd burned through nearly a quarter cord of wood and still woke to interior temperatures around 40 degrees. The corners of his cabin were noticeably colder, frost forming on the interior walls near the joints. His water bucket had frozen, despite sitting only 8 feet from the fireplace. Other miners reported similar experiences. The cold had exposed every weakness in traditional construction. Gaps that were invisible in moderate weather became obvious as thin lines of frost where cold air infiltrated. Even well-built cabins struggled to maintain barely tolerable temperatures, requiring constant fire tending and enormous fuel consumption. Angus's neighbors began noticing that his chimney produced remarkably little smoke. The small coal fire burned clean and steady, but the minimal output suggested inadequate heating. Surely he was freezing in that metal contraption. Some predicted they'd find him dead when the cold intensified further. Fergus stopped by on the 3rd day of cold weather, genuinely concerned. Angus invited him inside. Fergus stepped through the door and stopped, stunned. The interior was genuinely warm, noticeably more comfortable than his own cabin, despite the tiny stove and minimal visible fire. He could remove his heavy coat, something impossible in his own dwelling during this cold. How? Fergus asked simply. Angus explained again, pointing out the earth banking visible outside, describing how the ground temperature stabilized the structure's base. He explained the curved interior reflecting heat evenly. He noted the complete absence of air leaks that plagued traditional cabins. Fergus listened with new attention, no longer dismissing the concepts as theoretical nonsense. The evidence was undeniable. This strange metal shelter was outperforming proven construction dramatically. Word spread through the mining camp. The crazy metal structure that everyone had mocked was somehow working. A few miners came to look, though most remained skeptical. Angus must be exaggerating, or the cold hadn't truly tested the structure yet. Real winter would expose its flaws. They clung to this belief because accepting the alternative meant admitting their own considerable efforts had produced inferior results. Fergus Drummond returned to Angus's shelter 3 times over the following week, each visit motivated by genuine curiosity mixed with stubborn disbelief. He'd felt the warmth inside, seen the minimal coal consumption, observed that Angus moved about in shirt and vest, while Fergus himself wore layers even indoors. Yet accepting these observations meant abandoning principles Fergus had trusted his entire life. On his 3rd visit, Fergus brought 2 other miners, both experienced men who'd wintered in the mountains before. They examined the structure skeptically, walking around the earth-banked exterior, noting the patchwork metal surface, the small window, the modest chimney. Nothing about it suggested superior engineering. It looked improvised, almost desperate. Inside, the warmth was undeniable. The 3 visitors stood near the door, reluctant to remove their heavy coats despite the comfortable temperature. Angus sat at his small table in his shirt sleeves, eating a simple meal. The coal stove glowed softly, consuming fuel at a rate that seemed impossibly modest. "The metal's conducting heat from somewhere," one miner suggested. "Maybe there's a hot spring underneath, warming the ground." Angus shook his head. "The ground temperature is stable year-round, same as anywhere else at this depth, around 45 degrees. The earth banking uses that stability as insulation." "But metal conducts cold," Fergus insisted. "Everyone knows that. Touch a metal fence post in winter, your hand freezes to it. That metal shell should be drawing heat out of here faster than you can generate it." Angus walked to the curved wall and placed his palm against the interior metal surface. "Touch it," he said. The miners hesitated, then each placed a hand against the metal. It was warm, approximately the same temperature as the interior air. "The metal equalizes to whatever temperature surrounds it," Angus explained. "The earth-banked portion stays warm because it's in contact with warm ground. The upper portion warms from interior air and reflects radiant heat from the stove. There is no temperature gradient driving conduction. The explanation made theoretical sense, but it contradicted the miners' direct experience with metal in cold weather. They'd all touched frozen metal tools and felt how quickly metal pulled heat from flesh. The idea that the same material could somehow not conduct cold seemed paradoxical. "Wait until real winter," one miner said finally. "This is just November cold. Come January, when it drops to 40, 50 below, we'll see how well this works." The others nodded agreement. They needed this caveat, this promise of future vindication. Angus's success threatened their understanding of how things worked. If a lone man using salvaged materials and strange theories could build better shelter than men following proven methods, what did that say about their judgment and competence? They left without admitting what they'd observed. Back at Callahan's tent that evening, they reported that Angus's shelter seemed warm enough for now, but expressed confidence that extreme cold would expose its flaws. The metal would fail. The earth banking would freeze solid. The curved roof would collapse under heavy snow. Something would go wrong because it had to. The alternative was too unsettling. December brought sustained cold that settled over the Bitterroot district like a physical presence. Temperatures dropped into the 20s below zero and stayed there for days at a time. Traditional cabins became survival exercises. Miners burned wood constantly, rationing their carefully gathered stockpiles while knowing they might run short before spring. The cold found every weakness in conventional construction. Fergus Drummond's cabin, among the better-built structures in the district, required nearly a quart of wood per week to maintain barely tolerable interior temperatures. The corners remained perpetually cold despite the roaring fire. Frost formed intricate patterns on the interior walls each morning. His water supply froze unless kept within 3 feet of the fireplace. He wore heavy clothes indoors and still felt the cold creeping through gaps he couldn't locate or seal. Other miners fared worse. Cabins built hastily in September showed their shortcuts. Improperly fitted logs had shrunk and warped, opening gaps that whistled with incoming wind. Mud chinking had dried and cracked, falling out in chunks. Some miners resorted to hanging blankets along interior walls, creating dead air spaces for additional insulation. The blankets helped marginally, but also blocked what little light entered through small windows. The social dynamics in camp shifted. Miners who'd been friendly became irritable, the constant cold fraying nerves. Disputes arose over borrowed tools and unpaid debts. Several men abandoned their claims temporarily, heading down to Butte to wait out the worst months. Those who remained endured, telling themselves this was the price of independence and potential wealth. Angus's situation was notably different. His coal consumption held steady at approximately 20 pounds per day, maintaining interior temperatures between 58 and 65 degrees with minimal effort. He could work inside comfortably, repairing equipment, planning spring operations, reading the few books he'd brought. The structure required no constant tending. He could let the fire burn low overnight and wake to an interior that had cooled only slightly, easily restored to comfort with fresh coal. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Miners passing Angus's shelter saw minimal smoke from his chimney, suggesting inadequate heating. Yet on the rare occasions when Angus invited someone inside, they encountered warmth that exceeded what they could achieve with massive fuel consumption. The cognitive dissonance was profound and troubling. One miner, William Cobb, approached Angus in mid-December, asking detailed questions about the construction. Cobb had noticed his own wood supply running dangerously low with 3 months of winter remaining. He wanted to understand what Angus had done differently. Angus explained the principles again, patiently describing earth banking, thermal mass, curved geometry, and sealed construction. Cobb listened carefully, taking notes on a piece of bark with a pencil stub. "Could this be done with a cabin already built?" Cobb asked. Angus considered this. Banking earth against existing walls would help, but the rectangular shape, the corners, the gaps between logs, Those are fundamental design issues. You'd improve things, but not achieve what's possible with different geometry. Cobb nodded slowly, filing this information away. Late December brought warning signs that experienced miners recognized with dread. The sky took on a peculiar crystalline clarity, stars visible with unusual sharpness even through wood smoke haze. The wind shifted to the north and intensified, bringing air from deeper in the continental interior. Snow fell in tiny, hard granules rather than soft flakes, a phenomenon associated with extreme cold. The thermometer at Callahan's supply tent dropped to 37 below on December 28th. Old-timers muttered that worse was coming. Micah Thorne, the trapper who'd warned Angus and Donal about cabin weaknesses back in July, appeared in camp on December 30th. Micah lived alone 15 miles north, trapping a circuit that kept him mobile most of winter. His arrival in the mining camp was itself significant. He told anyone who'd listen that brutal cold was perhaps 2 days away, the kind of cold that killed exposed men in minutes and penetrated even good shelters. 1886 saw it drop to 63 below up on the Missouri, Micah said. Lost 2 toes that winter. Cabin I was in, the logs cracked from frost. Could hear them popping like rifle shots. Fire couldn't keep up. This feels the same. Miners who'd dismissed Micah's earlier warnings now listened with alarm. They spent December 31st frantically stockpiling additional firewood, hauling loads from their woodpiles into cabins until interior spaces were crammed with fuel. Some cut green wood in desperation, knowing it would burn poorly but needing volume. Others redistributed supplies, moving everything flammable closer to fireplaces. Fergus Drummond had perhaps 3 weeks of firewood remaining at normal consumption rates. If he needed to burn significantly more to counter extreme cold, he'd run out well before spring. He couldn't cut additional wood in deep winter, not efficiently. He faced a genuine crisis and knew it. Several other miners were in similar situations, having underestimated winter fuel requirements or lost time to injury and illness. Angus had half a ton of coal remaining, more than sufficient for the rest of winter at his current consumption rate. Even if he doubled his fuel use during extreme cold, he'd finish the season with reserves. This security was directly attributable to his structure's efficiency, requiring less fuel to maintain because it lost less heat. On the evening of December 31st, Angus walked through camp and observed preparations. Men were boarding up windows to reduce heat loss, sacrificing light for insulation. They were hanging additional blankets and canvas along interior walls. Some were repositioning sleeping areas closer to fireplaces, recognizing that distant corners would become uninhabitable. The organized near panic was striking, everyone recognizing that the next week would test them severely. Angus returned to his shelter, added coal to his stove, and settled in with a book. Outside, the temperature was dropping steadily. The wind had died completely, leaving absolute stillness that amplified the cold's intensity. Stars blazed with unnatural brilliance in the black sky. The thermometer read 41 below zero at 9 o'clock. It would drop further overnight. Tomorrow would bring the test everyone had predicted, the vindication or refutation of Angus's impossible metal shelter. January 1st, 1898 arrived with temperatures that seemed to defy natural limits. The thermometer outside Callahan's supply tent read 49 degrees below zero at dawn. By mid-morning, it had dropped to 53 below. The air itself seemed different, denser somehow, painful to breathe. Exposed skin froze in seconds. Metal objects became dangerous to touch even through gloves. The world had become actively hostile to human life. Inside Fergus Drummond's cabin, the situation bordered on catastrophic. He'd been feeding his fireplace continuously since midnight, burning wood as fast as it would catch. The fire roared, consuming fuel at rates he couldn't sustain beyond a few days. Yet the interior temperature hovered around 35 degrees. The corners were noticeably colder, frost forming thick layers on the walls near the joints. His water supply had frozen solid despite sitting near the fire. He wore every piece of clothing he owned and still shivered constantly. The cabin's weaknesses had become glaring. Cold air poured through gaps he couldn't see or reach. The rectangular corners created dead zones where frigid air pooled and circulated sluggishly. The tall ceiling meant he was heating enormous volume uselessly, while the occupied lower space remained barely tolerable. The logs themselves conducted cold inward, their exterior surfaces frozen to temperatures that transmitted through the wood despite its insulating properties. Fergus had moved his sleeping platform directly beside the fireplace, recognizing that the cabin's far end was uninhabitable. He'd burned a chair for additional fuel when his wood pile showed alarming depletion. By noon on January 1st, he'd accepted that he might not have enough fuel to survive the next week at this consumption rate. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Other cabins faced similar crises. William Cobb had run completely out of firewood by mid-morning and was burning his furniture, his spare lumber, even structural elements he could remove without immediate collapse. 2 miners had already abandoned their claims, hiking down to the lower camp in desperation despite the danger of travel in extreme cold. One arrived with severe frostbite on his face. The other never made it, found frozen on the trail 2 days later. The mining district had become a collection of desperate struggles against cold that overwhelmed traditional solutions. Men who'd built cabins according to proven methods, who'd stockpiled what they thought was adequate fuel, who'd prepared as their fathers and grandfathers had prepared, were losing battles against temperature that shouldn't have been survivable in any case. 200 yards from Fergus's cabin, Angus MacLeod sat at his small table writing in a journal. He wore a cotton shirt and wool vest, no coat. The interior temperature read 62 degrees. His coal stove glowed steadily, consuming approximately 25 pounds of fuel per day, only slightly more than his normal rate. The compact interior remained comfortable, the curved walls reflecting heat evenly, the earth banking moderating the structure's base temperature regardless of the murderous cold outside. Angus had woken that morning, added coal to the stove, and eaten breakfast normally. The extreme cold was certainly notable, but it didn't require emergency response or desperate measures. The temperature dropped further through January 1st, reaching 58 degrees below zero by evening. At that temperature, moisture in human breath crystallized instantly into visible clouds. Spit froze before hitting the ground. Any exposed metal burned skin on contact. The cold was beyond what most miners had ever experienced, beyond what their preparation had anticipated. Inside traditional cabins, men fought simply to survive each hour. Fergus had been burning wood continuously for 30 hours, his consumption rate far exceeding any sustainable level. The interior temperature had actually dropped despite the roaring fire, now reading only 30 degrees. The corners were below freezing. Ice coated the interior walls in thick layers. His fingers were numb despite heavy gloves worn indoors. He'd wrapped himself in every blanket he owned and still couldn't stop shivering. The wood supply was nearly exhausted. He'd already burned his table, his spare chair, the wooden crate that had held his tools. In Angus's shelter, the conditions were remarkably stable. The interior held at 60 degrees with no difficulty. The earth banking performed exactly as designed, the buried lower portion of the structure maintaining stable temperature regardless of surface conditions. The ground temperature 3 feet down hadn't changed, still around 45 degrees, creating a thermal foundation that prevented heat loss through the floor and lower walls. The curved metal shell, sealed completely against air infiltration, had no pathway for cold air to enter or warm air to escape. The compact interior volume meant the small coal stove could maintain comfortable temperature using fuel at rates that would seem impossible to anyone comparing it to traditional cabin heating requirements. Angus consumed approximately 1/10 the energy Fergus was burning while maintaining interior conditions that were 30 degrees warmer. The physics were straightforward but revolutionary. Traditional cabins presented enormous surface area to cold, had hundreds of air infiltration points, created corner zones where cold pooled, and fought against the environment through brute force fuel consumption. Angus's structure minimized exposed surface area, eliminated air infiltration completely, had no corners for cold pooling, and worked with natural thermal principles rather than against them. The difference in outcome was proportional to the difference in design philosophy. Angus spent the afternoon of January 1st reading and occasionally adding coal to his stove. He could hear the wind picking up outside, a steady howl that would make conditions even more dangerous for anyone in inadequate shelter. He considered checking on his neighbors, but recognized that opening his door would flood the interior with frozen air that would take time and fuel to overcome. Better to remain sealed inside his thermal envelope. By evening, the temperature outside had stabilized at 58 below. The mining camp was nearly silent, no one venturing outdoors unnecessarily. Smoke rose from cabin chimneys at volumes that indicated desperate burning. Angus's chimney produced its characteristic minimal smoke, the efficient coal fire creating little visible output. To observers, if any had been watching, this suggested Angus was either already frozen or about to be. No one could imagine surviving such cold with such minimal heating. The pounding on Angus's door came at dawn on January 3rd. The extreme cold had persisted for 56 hours, temperatures never rising above 45 below. Angus had been asleep on his platform, the interior cool but tolerable at 55 degrees after the overnight fire had burned low. The desperate hammering brought him fully awake instantly. He grabbed his coat and moved to the door. Fergus Drummond nearly fell inside when Angus opened the door. The older man's face was frost-burned, his movements uncoordinated, his speech slurred from hypothermia. He'd wrapped himself in blankets that were now crusted with ice from his frozen breath. Behind him, perhaps 30 yards away, his cabin showed no smoke from its chimney. The implication was immediate and clear. Fergus had run completely out of fuel. Angus pulled Fergus inside and secured the door quickly, minimizing cold air infiltration. He guided Fergus to a position near the stove and began removing the frozen blankets. Fergus's hands were dangerously cold but not yet frostbitten. His core temperature was low but survivable. He'd made the decision to seek help before reaching the point of no return, likely saving his own life by abandoning pride. Ran out. Fergus managed through chattering teeth. Burned everything, table, chairs, bed frame. Still couldn't keep warm. Cabin dropped below freezing 3 hours ago. Had to choose between freezing there or risking the walk here. Angus wrapped Fergus in dry blankets and positioned him where radiant heat from the stove would warm him most efficiently. He prepared hot tea using water from his supply bucket, water that had never frozen despite days of extreme cold. Fergus drank slowly, hands shaking, gradually regaining function as his core temperature stabilized. The contrast between the two shelters couldn't have been more dramatic. Fergus had consumed perhaps 2 cords of wood in 3 days and still failed to maintain survivable conditions. Angus had burned roughly 75 pounds of coal and maintained consistent comfort. Fergus had been forced to burn his furniture and eventually abandon his shelter entirely. Angus had never faced genuine hardship. "I was wrong," Fergus said finally, his voice steadier as warmth returned. "I don't understand how this works, but I was wrong. You tried explaining. I didn't listen. Called it foolishness. Nearly died for that certainty." Angus said nothing, simply refilled Fergus's tea and added more coal to the stove. The interior temperature had dropped to 52 degrees during the door opening and rescue, but was already recovering. Within an hour, it would return to normal 60-degree comfort, using perhaps 5 additional pounds of colol. Fergus remained silent for a long time, looking around the interior of the shelter he'd mocked so thoroughly. The curved walls, the earth banking visible where the door frame met the ground level, the compact, efficient volume, the complete absence of drafts or cold spots. Everything he'd dismissed as foolish had proven superior to generations of traditional knowledge. The extreme cold broke on January 6th, temperatures rising to a comparatively mild 10 below zero. Fergus had remained in Angus's shelter for 4 days, sharing the compact space while his own cabin sat abandoned and frozen. During those days, trapped together by weather, Fergus asked detailed questions about every aspect of the structure's design and construction. His earlier dismissiveness had transformed into genuine curiosity, born from undeniable experience. Angus explained the principles methodically, using diagrams scratched on bark with charcoal. He showed how Earth temperature remained stable, regardless of surface conditions, how the banking created a thermal foundation that required no fuel to maintain. He explained heat loss mechanisms, demonstrating how traditional cabins lost warmth through conduction, convection, and air infiltration simultaneously, while his structure eliminated or minimized each pathway. "The Earth 3 feet down stays around 45 degrees year-round," Angus repeated. "Bury part of your structure, you get that temperature for free. No fuel required. That's your baseline. Everything above that just needs to overcome the difference between 45 and whatever comfort level you want." Fergus grasped the concept intellectually, but struggled with its implications. If this was so effective, why hadn't anyone done it before? Why did generations of frontier builders use methods that were demonstrably inferior? Angus suggested that tradition often persisted not because it was optimal, but because it was familiar. Men built log cabins because their fathers built log cabins. Questioning the approach required both knowledge of alternatives and willingness to risk failure while testing new methods. "You risked failure," Fergus pointed out. "Everyone thought you'd freeze." "I calculated the risks," Angus replied. "The principles were sound. Miners used them underground without thinking about it. I just applied them to surface shelter. The worst outcome was being wrong and needing to build a traditional cabin in January, uncomfortable but survivable." When temperatures moderated enough for safe travel, other miners ventured out to check on neighbors. They found Fergus at Angus's shelter, alive and healthy. The story spread quickly. Fergus, an experienced mountain man with a well-built cabin, had been forced to abandon his shelter and seek refuge in the metal structure everyone had mocked. The validation was absolute and undeniable. William Cobb was the first to ask Angus for detailed construction advice. He wanted to modify his existing cabin, banking earth against the walls and sealing gaps more carefully. Others followed with similar questions. Could these principles be applied to conventional construction? How much improvement could be achieved without complete rebuilding? Angus shared everything he knew, drawing diagrams, explaining material choices, describing techniques. By late January, 3 miners had begun earth-banking their cabins, piling soil against lower walls and packing it carefully. 2 others started planning new structures for the following season, incorporating curved elements and earth sheltering into designs that blended traditional and innovative approaches. The impossible had become studied, analyzed, and cautiously adopted. Angus's gamble had proven successful in the most convincing way possible through direct comparison during extreme conditions that allowed no ambiguity about relative performance. Angus MacLeod worked his claim through the spring and summer of 1898, extracting modest but consistent gold that justified his continued presence. His shelter, proven through the brutal winter, became a reference point for discussing construction throughout the district. Miners planning to winter over asked to examine it, taking measurements and notes. Some copied specific elements. Others developed variations suited to their situations and available materials. By 1899, 5 earth-sheltered structures existed in the Bitterroot district, each incorporating principles Angus had demonstrated. None were identical to his design, but all showed the influence of his approach. Earth-banking became common even for traditional cabins. Miners, recognizing that partial implementation of thermal mass principles improved performance noticeably, The collective knowledge of the mining community had shifted, incorporating new understanding of heat loss mechanisms and alternative building geometries. Fergus Drummond rebuilt his cabin in the summer of 1899, incorporating a curved roof section and substantial earth banking. The hybrid design combined traditional log walls with innovations borrowed from Angus's structure. Fergus wintered successfully in this modified shelter, using roughly one-third the fuel his original cabin had required. He became an advocate for earth sheltering, explaining the principles to newcomers with the enthusiasm of a convert. The broader mining frontier gradually absorbed these innovations through informal networks. Miners moved between districts, carrying knowledge with them. A prospector who'd seen Angus's shelter in the Bitterroots might build something similar in the Yukon. That structure would be observed by others, the principles discussed and adapted further. By 1900, earth-sheltered and partially buried structures appeared sporadically throughout cold climate mining regions, each representing local interpretation of concepts that had proven effective. Angus himself left the mountains in 1901, having accumulated enough capital to purchase farmland in western Montana. He married in 1903, started a family, and lived quietly until his death in 1928 at age 56. He never wrote about his shelter design, never sought recognition or profit from his innovation. To his family, he was simply a former prospector who'd done well enough to buy land and settle down. But in the mountains, his shelter remained standing for decades, maintained by subsequent occupants who recognized its value. The structure lasted until the 1950s, finally abandoned when mining activity in the district ceased entirely. By then, similar designs had appeared in military applications, most notably the Quonset hut developed during World War II, which used identical principles of curved metal construction and earth banking for temporary but effective shelter in extreme conditions. The connection between Angus's 1897 innovation and later widespread adoption of similar designs cannot be traced through direct lineage, but the principles he demonstrated, earth integration, curved geometry, sealed construction, and minimal surface area, became standard approaches for extreme climate shelter. His legacy wasn't a named invention or patented design, but rather a proved concept that entered collective knowledge and persisted because it solved real problems more effectively than traditional alternatives. The impossible shelter that everyone mocked had become, through patient demonstration and gradual adoption, simply one more tool in humanity's repertoire for surviving harsh environments.